Growing up in the low country of South Carolina, being a part of this community my entire life, I very often joke that salt water runs through my veins and I love the smell of pluff mud. But what I realized was that there was so much that I did not know about this community. When I think about the mission of the International African American Museum, I think about our desire to tell the stories that have been undertold. It's important that people understand what's happened and why. This is a starting place for people who look like me. More than 800 slave ships that came right into Charleston came right here to this exact spot, Gadsden's Wharf. 40% of all the enslaved Africans who came to North America were brought here. We have a duty and a mission to create a museum that truthfully explains our history in this country. And so I look at the International African American Museum as a place not only for reflection and information, but a place of celebration. I think that it will become a central place for information and education, not only for the Low Country, but really for the world. Good evening, and welcome to our News 2 special report, celebrating the opening of the International African American Museum, where history comes alive. We followed this project from inception to construction, and now it's opening. But before we take you inside the new museum, we journey back to its origin. In 2016, an interview with Charleston Mayor Joe Riley, he told me that he placed a note in the breast pocket of his suit every day, and written on the note were the words, "Build the museum." He said of all the buildings, bridges, and ballparks built during his 40-year career as mayor, constructing a museum that would tell the story of the transatlantic slave trade was the most important to him. For 23 years, that vision has been coming into focus. After centuries of being buried, history is alive.
Yes, my Lord, you're the best in any kingdom.
Millions of enslaved men, women, and children captured in Africa, chained and shackled during the journey across the Atlantic Ocean.
Between 40 and 48% of all enslaved Africans that came to what is now the United States would have come through this very spot.
This very spot is Gadsden's Wharf. The executive director of the International African American Museum says stories that originated in Africa are finally being told.
This is a place that tells story of trauma, but this is also a place that tells stories of joy.
Dr. Tanya Matthews says the idea of the International African American Museum took root when Charleston's longest-serving mayor read the book Slaves in the Family by Edward Ball.
It was 1998, I read the book Slaves in the Family, written by Edward Ball, and through the book then I learned for the first time the harshness and the challenge and the brutality. More enslaved human beings were brought here to the site than any other place in North America. We have to build a museum.
Joseph Riley read a book that changed his life, and out of that transformation, he decided that Charleston needed to be telling the story of African American history and was discovering that we could tell it like no one else could.
2 years ago, Charleston Mayor Joe Riley gave us a tour of the museum as it was being built.
And it's lifted up in reverence of what happened here.
As we walk between the 18 columns that raise the building off the ground where enslaved Africans died, Mayor Riley explained that every detail, from bricks to indigenous grasses, were selected to showcase the lessons brought from West Africa that shape who we are and how we live.
Building the physical beauty of it, the material, the design.
Dr. Matthews explains the central idea behind the museum that now stretches across 45,000 square feet is that this will be an evolving institution centered on truth. Let's talk about this space. Why was it so important that this museum happened here on this particular site?
The museum has the humbling privilege and responsibility of reclaiming a portion of Gadsden's Wharf. So Gadsden's Wharf is one of our nation's most prolific former transatlantic slave trading sites.
Local, state, and national leaders broke ground on the International African American Museum in 2019. And now 4 years later, as history is being revealed, there are many people to thank for being caretakers of the dream.
I think there are a lot of thanks involved. There are thanks from the very, very beginning, of course, to Mayor Riley and those who entertained his ridiculous idea of building the second largest African American history museum in the country in Charleston. Congressman Jim Clyburn, who stood there in the beginning, board members, advisors, and then of course we have donors and contributors, right? Unfunded hope is a dream. And so we've had a lot of folks who have invested in the project, and those who invested before they knew it was certain, and those who invested once they saw it was certain and important and simply needed to be bigger and more powerful.
As we continue our coverage of the opening of the International African American Museum, the museum's director says the opening events offer something for everyone.
I'm so excited. You know, we do indeed have a gala. We have a large opening dedication ceremony that has room for thousands of folks down in Marion Square.
Thank you for staying with us for our News 2 special report celebrating the International African American Museum, where history comes alive. The International African American Museum represents the journey from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean and through to America. We sat down with the CEO of the International African American Museum before it opened to the public. Dr. Tanya Matthews says the paths and pursuits of enslaved Africans and ultimately African Americans are on display as testimony to triumph over tribulations.
One of the things that we can do as a First Voice museum, an African American museum telling African American stories, is we can put that period in context and recognize that this period of slavery is neither the beginning nor the end of our story, but it's an important part in the middle.
The International African American Museum is the second largest museum dedicated to African American history and culture in America. Standing on Gadsden's Wharf, the place where nearly half of all enslaved people were brought to North America, the museum is expected to fuel the Lowcountry's economic engine. So how will you measure the museum's success?
Obviously, we're going to have our economic impact studies, and obviously we're going to be looking at our ability to fundraise. But we also want to look at, say, our member role, not because folks pay to be members, but because that's the number of people who raise their hand to say, we stand with the International African American Museum.
The CEO of Explore Charleston, Helen Hill, says, in part, the International African American Museum stands poised to be a transformative force in the Charleston economy. Let's talk about some of the delays, some of the challenges that you face in getting the museum open.
I think in retrospect, as I think about our delays in context, it's extraordinary that we broke ground in late 2019. And then the world turned upside down for a good 2 years or so, and we find ourselves here in 2023. Some of those delays were our commitment to get this absolutely right. And I hope and I expect that when folks walk into the museum, they won't say, wow, I can't believe it took so long. They'll say, oh my, how did they get it done so quickly?
And when she describes what they did inside of the museum, she directs our attention to interactive technology in every gallery, on every wall, and atop every table. She says the museum's mission is to help visitors connect with history.
So now imagine doing it 8 hours a day.
The International African American Museum, designed to be a special place where people will engage with artifacts and exhibits and information in a unique way, in this place where history is alive. And now what you've been waiting for, going inside the International African American Museum. It is a museum unlike any in the world. It is a place for reverence, reflection, and learning, and we will take you there when we come back. The International African American Museum is the second largest museum dedicated to African American history and culture in this country. When visitors stand at the former Gadsden's Wharf, they will not only see artifacts and exhibits, they will walk where pain and perseverance changed a nation. Here is your first look inside this space that brings centuries together. Dr. Tanya Matthews, the museum's chief executive officer, says the story is layered and complex, so telling its history is done carefully.
We have several galleries trying to sort of tell the African American journey in context.
Dr. Matthews took us on a tour through the 46,000 square foot structure, showing and telling us why this museum will be a voice for untold and forgotten stories.
So when you first walk into the building, you'll see the transatlantic experience.
The Transatlantic Gallery consists of 8 digital screens telling stories, showing images from ancient civilizations in Africa to modern times.
You come through that gallery and then you end up in the Gullah Geechee Gallery. I would argue that every American history museum should have a little bit of Gullah.
And there is a lot of Gullah in the Gullah Geechee Gallery, a scaled-down praise house filled with the sounds of spirituals and the beloved Charleston handclap. A bateau commissioned by the museum sits broadly in the center of this space.
You go from there to African roots and routes, making a nice connection.
Dr. Matthews says the International African American Museum has 2 ways of thinking and delivering content. One is origin stories.
We go back to 300 BCE. We talk about the fact that human rice cultivation was recorded on the continent of Africa that far back.
The African Roots and Routes Gallery highlights modern African diasporic connections.
And then you leave that vibrant and alive gallery to enter one of our smallest and probably most powerful galleries. That is the Port of Departure. It's a very simple gallery, and it just contains names and ages of people who were enslaved.
From top to bottom and side to side, the names of enslaved adults and children obtained from recorded court cases. The Port of Departure Gallery has a sister gallery, the Port of Arrival.
There are still names, but these names are very American given. And these names come from our own records of plantations here in the Low Country.
In between these 2 galleries is the Atlantic World Gallery.
So the Atlantic Worlds Gallery is a mashup of African diasporic culture. You've got Haiti, Sierra Leone, Charleston, New Orleans, all of these places mixed up together. And part of what we're doing is making this deliberate connection.
The Atlantic World Gallery also explains why Charleston, why this port, why Gadsden's Wharf was so important in the transatlantic slave trade. Looking out the windows, the Atlantic Ocean, the connection that brought millions of enslaved people to Charleston.
Once you leave the Atlantic Worlds Gallery, then you step into Carolina Gold.
One of the things that differentiates the International African American Museum is that this museum tells the story of slavery through rice cultivation.
Many of us learn the story through cotton, but we talk about how this Carolina Gold was the cash crop here in the Low Country, ultimately making Charleston the richest city in all of the colonies.
Dr. Matthews says it wasn't just the labor, it was the knowledge, the know-how, and then the innovation of enslaved Africans that contributed to the wealth of the colonists.
As you come out of Carolina Gold, you will enter Carolina Connections.
Dr. Matthews says many of the stories associated with African American history in this country has origins in South Carolina, like the desegregation of America's schools. As we walk through the American Journeys Gallery,
This is actually from the 1800s.
Dr. Matthews explained this gallery includes modern touches of technology and contemporary art.
1400s all the way up to modern time. It's a giant U-shaped gallery, includes artifacts, also includes modern oral histories of folks that I think people here in the Low Country will recognize, telling their own stories of today.
Finally, the Center for Family History.
The Center for Family History is the size of one of our largest galleries, where we'll be staffed with genealogists and ancestry researchers to help anyone who's interested in learning a little bit more about their great-great-great-grands and the stories that they have to tell as well.
And And beneath the museum,
our gardens are collectively referred to as the African Ancestors Memorial Garden. It was designed by a landscape architect by the name of Walter Hood, and everything is intentional. We have a black granite wall exhibition to help us honor and tell the story of a former storage house. But again, it's both trauma and joy, and that installation includes not only hunched figures that represent those we lost, but excerpts from Maya Angelou's poem, And Still I Rise.
Dr. Matthews says this tidal tribute pool is a place for reverence and reflection.
The waters in the pool are powered by a pumping system that raises and lowers the water with the tide. And at the bottom of that pool is an art installation of water, but also people, human figures, reminiscent of the way that Africans were packed into the bottom of slave ships. Right there on the edge, so you're looking at this pool and the Atlantic Ocean simultaneously. Our east yard and our west yard can hold hundreds of folks. And so we're just really excited about the kind of planning and gathering and I don't know, performing, cooking demonstrations that we could actually have in that space as well.
After 2 decades of planning, the purpose is realized. The International African American Museum tells the stories of how Africans and African Americans used intelligence, ingenuity, and insight to shape every aspect of the world. History is alive at the International African American Museum.
And of course, at the end of the day, I want an experience that compels you to tell someone else that you need to experience this, and can I go with you when you do, because I've got to go back.
From idea to opening, it has taken 2 decades to get to the opening of the International African American Museum. We take you to the heart of Charleston and inside this place where history is alive.
I want visitors to see a little bit of themselves, no matter what your background, no matter what your journey. This is our story, and I'm just very excited to learn what people take from what they learn inside the museum.
Thank you for staying with us for our News 2 special celebrating the International African American Museum, where history comes alive. Here is a look at the weekend of events. Thursday, the opening worship service is happening. In fact, in just a few minutes, it starts at Morris Proud AME Church in downtown Charleston. On Friday, there's a private gala and dinner. It's being held at Charleston Place. The public can enjoy the dedication, though, live from Marion Square in downtown Charleston, starting at 10 a.m. Saturday. And Tuesday, June 27th, the International African American Museum opens to the public. Thank you for being with us, and we hope you've enjoyed our coverage. Stay with us. News 2 at 6 is straight ahead.